in your head, there's just a bunch of ideas and things, and they're kind of jumbled and they're kind of loosely connected to each other. So this is sometimes called a network or a web or a graph. So in computer science, we call this a graph. It's just a bunch of nodes connected to each other in no real order whatsoever. So in your head, you have all these ideas like this. And the really hard part about writing is you need to take this loose jumble of ideas, some of which are connected to each other, and these are connected to these, and these are kind of connected to these. And you have to start structuring them somehow and having these kind of coalesce into a structure, and this one connects to this one connects to this one, and then having it be kind of ordered. And in the end, what you end up with is some kind of a rough kind of path through this weird graph. And in the end, what happens is you have to string it into a string of words on a page, right? Because whenever you write, the only thing you can show to your audience is just a bunch of words that just is read like this, right? Just right in order like this. But in your brain, it's all like messy and mushy like that, right? So this is why I think writing is really hard for everybody, is that you need to go from this mush in your brain to a really nice linear progression of words that just read smoothly. Because when someone is reading your writing, they don't see this. This is your brain, right? No one sees that. Instead, they see just this. That's all they see. And they need to take what they're reading in a line and kind of infer what you were thinking in your head. And that's really hard. So one way to ease this is by creating, say, an outline, right? So one of the best practices for writing is to start structuring your messy graph like this into some kind of order. So one of the problems with a graph as a data structure is that there's no order and anything connects to anything else. So we have something else called a tree that's a lot more structured. So a tree, otherwise known as a hierarchy or an outline, is basically a graph, except every node has a certain number of children like this. So this has some children. This one might have some children of its own. This one might have another child here, and this has some children of its own, and so forth. So you can imagine starting to turn this graph into a tree by saying, these three things are kind of connected, so we want to, connect it to these three things, and then we want to connect to these three things. And you imagine if you can somehow magically take these groupings and lift them up off the page, right, in the third dimension somehow, then you start turning this mess into globs of nodes here and more globs and stuff, and they start connecting with each other into other globs. This is the vertical direction, and this connects to this, and then this connects to this, and you start getting kind of from this messy graph here, start getting kind of a hierarchy, and that's what really an outline is. Right, so once you get an outline, you can now play with the outline and move stuff around and change things and title things and everything and move things around. And then what happens is, instead of going directly from this crazy graph into basically a bunch of strings together, you go from the graph to the outline, and you go from the outline to the strings. Because then what you can do is, after you move around your outline, you just walk over this outline and try to form it into sentences. So it's easier than just going directly. So this is kind of the traditional path of writing, of having some kind of an outline or rough structure and going to text. But I think what's more interesting is going backwards. So this is what we're all used to, from a graph to a tree to basically this is a string, right? A string is just a bunch of characters. So we're used to graph, tree, string. But what I think is more interesting to think about is how you go backwards. So a lot of times what happens is, when you write, the first time you write something, obviously it's not going to be perfect. So you actually spend most of your time as a writer not writing, but actually editing, right? So you have a bunch of text in front of you that either you wrote or somebody else wrote. And your job is to take this bit of text and to make it better. And the problem with operating on text itself as a string is that you don't see the underlying structure. All you see is just a bunch of words. And what happens when people try to edit text, if you just give someone a document to edit, to either proofread or on the computer to edit, they make these really local changes that are very, they're little grammatical changes, typos, spelling changes, and stuff. It's helpful to kind of polish the text, but they're not really getting at the essence of what's underneath, which is which is this graph here, which is in your head. So how can we actually improve that? So I think that currently the way we have people edit or proofread is not optimal because they can only make these small local changes. And people who are more advanced at editing know to look at, say, the paragraph level. They know to say, I'm going to read this whole paragraph and give you a comment on the entire paragraph structure or kind of a cadence or such. And I'm not just going to nitpick on little things, but it takes a little bit more advanced thing to do. So instead, one idea is to actually try to reverse engineer this piece of text into, say, an outline, back into an outline, and also maybe back into a graph. So this actually can be done much more easily, I feel, on pen and paper than on the computer. Because if you're on the computer, what happens is that if someone gives you a document in, say, Microsoft Word, you're just tempted to start editing it right away or start making little nitpicky comments. You're not really, it's really hard to take a bunch of text like this and actually go backwards. So what I prefer to do is actually, one technique is to actually get away from the computer. You can read, this is why reading stuff on paper is so helpful too. So imagine I get away from the computer, I have a document in front of me, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have a separate piece of paper, say here, that's just completely blank. And what I want to do is as I'm reading this thing, I will start drawing out its structure here. I will start drawing out, oh, this is what this point is, and this point is underneath this, and these have some subpoints. And then when I draw this out, maybe it's a tree here. Maybe I even start drawing out in a much more free-form way of I'm just going to start writing words and start connecting to each other. And now that I've kind of started to reverse engineer the underlying structure, then I can stare at this piece of abstract art or this picture. I can stare at this representation and start thinking about how I would change things around or what things to emphasize, what things to delete, maybe delete this part, what things to put together. And now I'm away from all this text, so I don't have to be tempted by all the nitty gritty and stuff. And now that I've kind of made my changes here, I can then try to push everything back into the text and kind of refine it. And but I think the point I'm getting at is I think it's really hard as an editor to directly edit the text because you're really tempted to edit these very small things and not to really go back into what's in their head. So I guess the moral of the story is that when you're first starting to write, it's a graph of thoughts in your head. You try to make it concrete into a tree that has some hierarchical structure, and you make that tree into a piece of into a string in the text itself. But I think in editing, you actually want to go backwards. You want to take the string itself and go back into the tree and go back into the graph as much as you can so you can kind of see these structural issues. And then you, of course, have to eventually push it back because in the end, the final product is always going to be a string of text, right? Nobody shows a bunch of random words to people unless you want to be an abstract artist or something. Everybody has to end up with a piece of polished writing that's just a bunch of letters separated by spaces and lines. But getting there is really the hard part.